Hi, I'm Hope Dector, Creative Director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women, and I'm here to welcome you to the fourth and final workshop in the Building Capacity for Mutual Aid Groups series presented by Dean Spade and co-sponsored by BCRW, Fireweed Collective, and Survived and Punished New York. Tonight's workshop will focus on bringing new people into the work. How do we recruit more people into our groups, help them get deeply plugged in and feel co-stewardship of the work? How do we create and maintain supportive group culture as new people join? How do we set shared expectations and help new members build skills for accountability in the work? In addition to marking the last workshop in this series, tonight's workshop also marks the first event in BCRW's spring programming. We have many exciting events planned for the upcoming months, including the annual Scholar and Feminist Conference. This year's conference, entitled Living in Madness, Decolonization, Creation, Healing, includes a number of incredible sounding discussions and workshops, including a mad mapping workshop by Fireweed Collective, all taking place online over the next few months. You can learn more at the link that Sophie is dropping into the chat now. We also encourage you to check out all of BCRW's spring programming, including Abolition on the Ground, reporting from the movement to defund the police on March 1st, featuring Angelica Cesaro, Erica Perry, and Andrea Ritchie, in a conversation moderated by Dean Spade. More info about all of these events can be found at bcrw.barnard.edu. I want to offer a few quick notes on accessibility and gratitude, starting with the land acknowledgement. Tonight's event is taking place online, but we are all physically located someplace, and we recognize that all land is Indigenous land. Barnard College is located on the traditional ancestral territories of the Lenape people. In terms of accessibility, you can find a link to access live transcription for this event directly under the video on the BCRW event page or in the YouTube video description. Thank you to Jay Narao from Total Caption for providing the live transcription. Our ASL interpreters for tonight's event are Gloshonda Lawyer and Kenton Myers. Gloshonda and Kenton, thank you both so much for your work to provide this essential service. We're so happy to be working with both of you. We're planning for tonight's workshop to take place for 1.5 hours, ending around 8:30 Eastern Time. If you have a question for Dean, you can type it into the YouTube chat. We'll be collecting any questions there for the Q&A that will take place towards the end of the workshop. I also want to thank my coworkers at BCRW for making this workshop series possible, including Elizabeth Costelli, Pam Phillips, Avi Cummings, Miriam Neptune, and especially Sophie Kreitzberg, who's coordinating so much of the work that goes into these events behind the scenes, including managing the visuals and communications during the event. And to BCRW student research assistant, Eve Glazier, who is working with Sophie behind the scenes tonight. We're so excited to be partnering with Fireweed Collective and Survived and Punished New York to bring you these workshops. Huge thanks to both of these amazing organizations, and we encourage everyone to check out their work via the links in the event description. In addition to the 4 workshops in the Building Capacity for Mutual Aid Groups series, we're working with Dean to create short video highlights that can serve as tools for people looking for quick information addressing specific issues common to mutual aid groups. So far, we've released 9 short videos that address consensus decision-making, facilitation, burnout, and group culture around capacity, among others. As we continue to release additional short videos, we'll post them on BCRW's YouTube, as well as on Dean's Instagram and other social media. I'm always so happy to be introducing Dean Spade, who has been an amazing longtime collaborative partner for me and has worked with BCRW to create videos and programming on mutual aid, prison abolition, queer liberation, disability justice, and transformative justice. Dean Spade is the author of Mutual Aid, Building Solidarity During This Crisis and the Next, as well as Normal Life, Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics, and the Limits of the Law. Dean teaches at Seattle University's School of Law and has been working in social movements to end prisons, borders, poverty, and war for over 2 decades. Dean, thank you for all of your work creating this series and tonight's workshop.
Thanks, Hope. Really glad to be here. I just was realizing that I first started working with BCRW in the last century. It's a really long time ago. I'm calling in from Duwamishland, Seattle, Washington. Excited to be here. Really grateful for everybody at BCRW for making these workshops happen. Hopefully they've been helpful. And really grateful to the ASL interpreters and the captioner working with us tonight. Yeah, Hope, let's share my slides. Cool. Okay. All right, so my own access notes for tonight. I'm going to have a few polls that we can participate in online. Totally fine if that doesn't work for you. No need to participate. There's going to be the live transcription link in the chat on Twitter and on YouTube. I'm going to read what's on my slides, so it's fine if you aren't looking at the screen and are just listening to this workshop. And I'm going to read some of what comes through on the polls in the chat. I can't read it all because it's a lot, but you'll still get some of that. So it's fine not to look at your screen. And feel free to take breaks as much as you need. This is being recorded, and the video and the slides and the poll results will all be posted afterwards. So you could just look at it all later if it's moving too fast or you get tired or need to take breaks. Hopefully that's helpful. What I'm hoping to do tonight in this 90 minutes is talk a little bit, do some polls to talk about who's here and what kinds of recruitment needs you all are seeing in your mutual aid groups for those people who are in mutual aid groups. Talk a little bit about why we need more people doing mutual aid, so why recruitment is so important. Talk about what is in the way of and what can make possible getting more people to join and stay in our work. And talk a little bit about leadership qualities, which is something that was the original topic of tonight's workshop, but I shifted to this topic around getting people to join and stay in our groups because I saw that as coming up a lot as something that people were describing as a challenge. So let's start by taking some polls. So Sophie is putting the links in the chat. The first poll that we can all just take together, and we put this up on the screen now, is how big is your group? So just in terms of people who are here at this workshop, I'm curious what size your group is now. How many people are actually active in your group? We'll see the results come in as people fill out the poll. I really enjoy watching the results come in. It's fun. So it seems like most people are in groups that are about 5 to 15 people. And then we've got a few people who are in really large groups, which is really interesting. And I'm seeing in the chat too, a lot of people are in groups that are 15 to 30 people or under 10 to 15. Cool. All right, just gives us a sense of, the size of these groups people are in. Let's go to the next question, Sophie. How true is this statement for your group? Our group needs more people to do this work well. So how true is it that your group is struggling with not having enough people to do the work? A lot of people are saying that their group does not have enough people to do the work. One person is saying their group has enough people, which is great. Congratulations. Seems very common that people are at least somewhat wishing there were more people in their group. Okay. Let's try the next slide, Sophie. Next poll. What are the impacts of not having enough people doing mutual aid work? Really curious to hear people, if you don't have enough people, how does that impact you or the world or the group? Yeah, the group can't do as much. People experience resentment and burnout. Co-optation. Letting people down. Avoidance can be discouraging. Ableism. Lack of resources. Limiting. Burnout is still the biggest answer that people are putting on there. I'll make this bigger to see if I can see it better. Exhaustion, can't take big projects, loss of motivation, limited reach, members are over capacity, stretched thin, conflict, gaps, people are tired, people have lost motivation, lack of accountability, lacking complexity, interesting, losing hope, yeah, unsustainable, slacking off, giving up, someone wrote, needs go unmet, feels like a Band-Aid, someone wrote. Yeah, thank you all for these insights into what it's like to not have enough people. Okay, thanks. And we'll share these results so that people can look at them in detail after the workshop. Let's go back to the slides. Hope. Are we here? Yeah, okay. So my opinion, we need to get bigger, like really badly. Like our movements need to be bigger, bolder, and a big part of that is just that we're living under really terrible conditions. I'm sure you all are noticing, more and more people are unhoused, more and more people don't have sufficient income, don't have healthcare, don't have childcare, are isolated, don't have companionship, don't have resources for old age or for if they become sick or disabled. There's just a lot of really intense conditions going on. People can't access the basic things they need to protect from COVID or other risks. So the conditions are really bad, and we're not getting what we need from like the government. So we really, really need big mutual aid groups, mutual aid groups reaching a lot of people. And that can mean groups of all sizes, but it really means more groups. I don't think the answer, and we'll talk about this later, is to try to build like the world's single biggest mutual aid project that's centralized. We've talked a lot in this workshop series about the value of decentralized groups and of people replicating each other's good ideas, but doing it in their own way that makes sense in their neighborhood or in their subculture or whatever. But ultimately, we just need so many more people to be joining groups that do work that cares for one another and brings them into social movement engagement, like so many more. And I think most of us feel that. We feel like one place I feel it a lot is that there's so many unhoused people living in encampments in our cities and even in our counties and rural areas in different ways. And then the police come and, raid them and evict them. And it would be so amazing if every time the cops tried to do that, we had enough people to fight them off. But we don't. So instead we go and we try to help people move or pack up, and it's this like scramble. They're just going to move to another spot and then be evicted again in another week or two. And the work is exhausting, and it's very, it leads to a lot of harm and loss for the people who are being evicted again and again. So just imagining, like, what if we had enough people that every time they tried to raid an encampment, we stop them, and every time they tried to arrest somebody, we stop them, and every time ICE tried to pick people up, we just got in the way. Like, what would it be like to imagine just being so peopled up? The other thing is that, as your answers to the last poll really addressed, mutual aid work is much more sustainable when there's enough people doing it. When there's not enough people, we tend to have conflict, get exhausted, do the work poorly, not show up when we said we'd show up, lose trust in the community, people who were expecting us to be there. It's just essential that we people up more. This is my graphic that I designed that I'm very proud of. My first efforts to use the computer to design such a thing. It's a picture of a target that's like rainbow. So the outermost ring is red, and it goes in through to purple in the center. And this image, what it means to me, there's a white arrow kind of going from the outside to the inside. And what this image means to me is that the point of all of our groups is to take people who are on the outside, who are people who might care about this work, who might be affected by it, and try to bring them deeper and deeper into leadership, so that people on the outmost of this target have never heard of our group. And then people who are in the red circle, like they walked by our table or they saw our flyer. And then people in the orange circle, like people who like came by and talked to us once, or grabbed some food, or grabbed some diapers, or got some kind of support from us. And people who are in the yellow circle, like actually came to one of our meetings and they're kind of interested maybe in volunteering. And people who are in the green circle, signed up for a shift and came really regularly. And people who are in the turquoise circle, like started getting involved in really like governing the org, like started to be like, oh yeah, I'm showing up at the budgeting meetings, or I'm joining the team that does the communications, or I'm coming to the to the retreat where we're talking about our big plans for the next 6 months. Like they really started governing. And people in the purple center are doing that governing and really working on how to bring more people through that pipeline. And the goal of it is to have more and more and more people do work in movement orgs more deeply, so that they're getting new skills. Like maybe they're getting those communication skills, or those facilitation skills, or those they're learning, more deeply what it means to dismantle racism. They're learning what abolition is, or they're learning, how we practice conflict prevention in groups, or they're learning how to share things, or whatever. Like we're building people who are getting more and more skilled for the conditions we're living under, and for participating in powerful resistance movements. And also people are getting hopefully more and more radical. So having a deeper and deeper disillusionment with harmful systems, and a deeper and deeper commitment to participate in disruption of those systems and building something new, and to have the backs of anybody else who's participating in disruption and building something new, so that our movements get bolder, because there's more and more courageous, bold people in them who have shared ideas about liberation. And as I've mentioned in previous workshops, mutual aid is most people's entryway into the movement, and we need huge movements. So we need tons and tons and tons of mutual aid groups that are not just doing great things, providing care, but also are people building machines, are good at bringing new people in and helping them become like more able to live their values and participate. So we don't really need a ton of mutual aid groups that were started by 3 people and always only include 3 people and are like scrambling to deliver these food and diapers, but everyone's exhausted. Like that's unlikely to build us the movement size we need. It's great, but it's likely to fall apart soon because of conflict and burnout. We need to figure out how to build groups that can bring in lots of people and help them get skills to be part of movement work. So in the chat, just to get us started in thinking about this, I would love it if people would say some things about these questions, like how did you first join? If we're going to think tonight about how we get people to join and stay, how did you first join movement work? And what made you deepen your engagement beyond a first march or symbolic action? A lot of us, the first time we did something, it was like something we heard of, like, the Women's March, or going to protest the inauguration, or something like that. What made you actually become part of a group instead of just going to an event? What made you get consistently involved in something? And what helped you stay in? So I'm just going to look at what people are writing in the chat. So the pandemic made some people join. I realized it wasn't enough for me not to be racist. That's really helpful. Thanks, Crystal. My skills were needed and I could do something for the group. That's helpful. We're going to talk about that. The Occupy movement inspired me. I made flyers and put them up around my rural school because I wasn't allowed to protest because I'm a conservative family. Seeing community action needed, staying, oops, I lost that one. I first started because I was trying to find a better way for the school system for my children. I stayed because I realized how much more I could do for my community. Finding something to commit to, like known shifts. Thanks, Eric, right? Like finding out there was a way, it sounds like, to like get in and like actually like know when I'm supposed to be there. Seeing a need firsthand, watching state violence. Court-ordered volunteer work 10 years ago brought me to help work with local food not bombs. That's really interesting. Sorry that you had court-ordered volunteer work, but that's cool that something grew out of it for you. I grew disillusioned with campaign work. I stayed for the community and close relationships it built. Thank you, Alejandra, right? Like people often stay in movement work because of our relationships. So we need to think about how can we make good relationship building machines in our groups. The only people who understood my deep anger and grief at the world. That's a really great point coming from Silver Springs and Tacoma Park Mutual Aid Group, right? Like people come because they want to break their isolation. Like, I'm so angry and scared and full of grief. I want to meet other people who care about this. It's like a deep need. Yeah, Ollie talks about how decolonial and transformative justice theory and writing helped them deepen into mutual aid work from just going to protest initially. My friends were my comrades and my comrades became my friends, and I wanted to show up and support them. That's what Natasha says. So again, focusing on the relationship piece, why we would stay in. Jasper says joining through loved ones' connections to mutual aid groups. Caroline says I stayed after getting to know the park community more personally. So that kind of belonging. Julie says protesting different social issues and then going to a people's town hall and meeting community organizers. So I think that's really interesting point, Julie, about like moving from being like, I'm at a march, but I'm not really meeting anybody. I'm just marching and chanting with others, to like something that makes you actually talk one-on-one with somebody from a group and find out, oh, there's a group I could join to do this all the time, not just when the big march is called. Reading leftist theory encouraged me to get out there and join a mutual aid revolutionary organization and try to build dual power. Cool. Thanks, Alicia. Stayed because of human connection and the sense of community, David says. Wanting something beyond political campaigning, Shan says. Got involved through my neighbor and got more involved because I loved the group members, Katie. So it sounds like Katie, like that experience of going in and being like, oh, I like these people. They're cool. They're being right on to me. Ash says I stayed because I knew things had to change. I knew things had to change, and doing anything besides this felt pointless. So that's amazing when you feel like the tactics you're using actually matter and might help, as opposed to like, why are we doing this? Is this going to do anything? Joyce is done with the status quo of nonprofits. Yeah. I think a lot of people get frustrated with that. Hadley says, I was new to the city and looking for community and connections with people who have shared values. Yeah. So like people join social movement work to make friends, to find people to hang out with who they like. Candace says, big storm in Texas caused extreme need, and I was able to join comrades from other movements to respond. Cool. So yeah, like a disaster of any kind, and we saw this so intensely at the beginning of COVID, can draw people into mutual aid. A lot of people who haven't even done it before. Erica says being in proximity to sweeps. So it sounds like seeing the cops sweep unhoused people was profoundly moving, and said, I have to do something about this. Ash says that Black feminist professors also changed their understanding and commitment. That's great. Lo Mobius says, it makes me happy. I'm so glad. This is fun to read, you all. I think it's helpful for us to think about this because we are the people now who need to help other people get in. So it's like, well, what made me want to stay? And am I creating an environment like that? And it's not like there's one answer to that, but it can be a good clue. Like, what made me think I'm sticking around here? This is fun, or this is satisfying, or this is needed. Katie says, now I stay because my unhoused neighbors love my tater tot casserole. I could really use some of that right now, Katie. People do really stay for food, and people really do show up for food and will hang out for food. It's like no joke, I stayed because I do social media and no one else wants to deal with it. Yeah. So that feeling, Candace, of being like, I'm doing something essential in this group that is helpful and people want it. I'm going to like, that's so meaningful. I feel like I'm making a contribution that matters and that other people appreciate. Anna Maria says that they got involved at the start of the pandemic and stayed due to the relationships and communities formed. Yeah, great. Thank you all for these really useful responses. So let's go to some polls again. Sophie, if you don't mind, let's just talk about what prevents people from first getting into movement work. What are some things that you all think prevent people from initially getting into movement work, like some obstacles? Learning curve, fear, lack of time, shyness, drama in theory, feeling different from the other people in the group, fear that they might not be good at it, accessibility issues, feeling intimidated and unsure if they'll fit in. It's scary to join groups that already exist. I think there's like a implied here, like a lot of people have a lot of social anxiety about like going to a new group where they won't know anybody. Like, will it be awkward? Will people like me? Am I the right kind of person? Am I cool enough? Am I whatever enough? Am I too old? Am I too young? Is everyone going to be whatever, not like me? Thanks for scrolling, Sophie. Thinking it won't matter. Yeah, a lot of people are like, there's nothing to be done. Not knowing how to plug in, right? Like it's hard to find social movement groups. Like it's easy to find, Pepsi. It's easy to find Walmart. It's really actually hard to figure like where are the mutual aid groups in my area? Like, are they on Facebook? Are they on, Instagram? Are those pages like for updated? Like, a lot of people who are doing really intense work in the streets aren't doing a ton of communication strategy or just don't have the capacity for it. So people are unsure where to start, unsure how to access it. People not knowing exactly what they're signing up for. Yeah. Time commitment unclear. People who can't imagine a different world. Yeah, that's a rough one. Complex trauma. Yeah. Thinking problems are too big for them to make a difference. Yep. Yeah, these are really great. And I would say too that when we think about people not having time, I just always want to remember that the people who have done the most and taken the biggest risks and used the boldest tactics in social movements in human history were always actually people who were living under the worst conditions, working the hardest, were the poorest, had the most kind of skin in the game and also the least to lose. So I think whenever we feel like no one's doing this because no one has time, I think it's also possible that there's more going on and that there are some people who absolutely cannot come, but there's more people who could come than are here now. People could I think our history shows that people can give an enormous amount to movements if given the opportunity and if recruited and and when they're feeling the press of really awful conditions, which I think people are feeling now and are going to keep feeling. Let's go to the next poll, Sophie. What makes people who get in never go deeper? Like people who like came to something, why didn't they go deeper? Or who go deeper, like why do they quit? Like what kind of, for those who make it past just going to a march or, you know, and actually like join a group or have a conversation with somebody in a group, what makes them not go deeper or quit? Maybe not my like best framed question I ever wrote in my life. All right, that's some good answers coming in here. Life happens, time restraints and conflict, burned themselves out and never got support with it. Group establishment hierarchy, other members being alienated, it's too hard or complicated, people's flakiness, dysfunctional organizational culture. That's what these workshops are about. Thinking that it'll be too much of a time commitment if they go deeper. Unresolved conflict, that is huge. That's a reason a lot of people leave social movement organizations. Fatigue, unclear action or what action steps or what to do to follow up. Someone mentions like feeling like they're not included as a trans person of color. I think that's like, yeah, like showing up at a group and getting a message that feels very familiar with other exclusions you're experiencing all the time. Overwhelmed by the amount of work. Lack of transparency in the organization, lack of like just disorganization in our groups. Yeah, drama, uncertainty. Yeah, someone wrote they have their selfie / proof of revolutionary brain moment and they look good and they don't think they need to do more. So that's like a real danger right now with like social media culture, kind of like I'm just here to be seen having been here rather than I'm in this movement for life. We're gonna talk more about that. Doesn't match what they imagined it would be. Yeah, oh, it's kind of boring or it's kind of hard. You know, it's not like you're giving a speech at the steps of the Capitol. It's like, no, you're changing a diaper. You're making an Excel spreadsheet. You're folding up burritos, you know. People not actually building relationships, that can be a reason they don't stay. Yeah, because relationships are pretty much what makes us stay. Unclear roles. Yeah, great. These are really helpful. Yeah, group hierarchy. Not having support. They dropped off at the first conflict. Yeah, people moving away because the community's in flux. Yeah, a lot of people are very displaced right now, and so like it's hard to stay in a community depending on your economic situation to dig in. Sometimes lack of transparency or lack of support leads to one bad experience or overwhelm, and people drop out not feeling a sense of belonging. I've talked to a lot of people who are like, oh, I went there once and it was fucked up. And so they like left and they're like, they have an opinion that like mutual aid doesn't work or social movements are bullshit. Like they just were kind of very, I would say like fragile, and one contact set them off. So we, as organizers, we need to be like, okay, people might be coming in really scared. How can we make that first contact as positive as possible? Because people might not have the bandwidth to keep trying if we were like rude the first time, or they felt excluded, or didn't feel heard, or whatever. Okay. Let's move away from the back to the slides, if you don't mind, Hope. Thank you. So yeah, a few more things I want to say about obstacles to joining, deepening, and staying, because we want new people. We want them to stay in and take on more and learn more and be in the movement for the rest of their lives, right? So some of the obstacles I see, like I mentioned, people cannot find the work. They're just like, I mean, people contact me all the time and they're like, how do I find mutual aid groups where I live? And so that, you know, there are resources. Maybe somebody wants to put mutualaidhub.org in the chat. And I also often tell people like, find some things in your region and see if you can reach anybody there, and then ask them what else exists that you didn't find, because so many mutual aid groups don't have a web presence at all. But yeah, it can be hard to find the work. And it tells us something about how badly we need to start recruiting more actively. A lot of people have just never heard of social movement work at all, or have never heard of mutual aid work, because we live in a society that lies to us about how social change happens. So we've been told social change is like when charismatic leaders make speeches and pass laws. And so people don't even know that there's a way to be like deeply involved for ordinary people instead of just hoping that like change comes from the government or something. A lot of people do experience unfriendly reception in our movements. Like, let's just be real. People are cliquish. People are judgmental. I think these are just features of insecurity and of surviving really rough systems. Like, I'm not judging us for it, but it definitely doesn't help. If you come into our meeting and you say one word different than we say it and we all like ice you out, like it's unlikely that you're going to stick around and help us win. So we do need to find ways to bring people in and let them grow and change and be influenced by us and influence us. But also just like I showed up to the thing and no one said hi or like, oh, hey, who are you? Where are you from? What brought you here? That kind of thing. I think a lot of people have this, like, it's hard to understand how to get more involved. Like, I know how to like show up when this group puts out a call on social media, like, hey, everybody go to City Hall, but I don't know how to be part of this group. One of my students today in class said that in her neighborhood, there's a mutual aid group and they were doing rapid COVID testing in the community garden. And that when she walked by, they like made it really easy to know how to get involved and volunteer with them. And I was like, that's such a success story that she's someone who hasn't been involved in movement work, but is interested in the ideas. And this group managed to get her attention and tell her how to join, like in a first meeting, right? So it's like really positive recruitment. As people have said, a lot of toxic group culture, people get turned off because they went and the meeting was really tense and people were mean to each other, or it was clear people were burned out. And so they're like, turned off and like not finding a way to feel like pleasure and excitement about being on purpose with this group. And a lot of people, I think, leave the work because they are doing it and they are frustrated and they're full of grief. People that they're doing mutual aid work with are getting arrested, are dying, are experiencing like terrible conditions, and they're exhausted and there's so few people doing the work and the need is so high. And so that is a recipe for unsustainability. So that's why we need to people it up. So let's think about what helps people join, deepen, and stay. And the first thing I want to talk about is welcoming group culture. How do we create welcoming group culture? So in the chat, let's talk about that. People write your ideas about like, what makes a welcoming group culture? There's not one right idea for this, but let's like give our best ideas to each other. What does it look like or feel like when it's welcoming? I'm also curious if people have seen like really fun, hot, irresistible recruitment strategies, historical, contemporary, that you want to share that we can like be inspired by right now. Compassion and empathy. It sounds like that's somebody's idea about like kind of what makes the group feel more welcoming. Listening to what people have to offer. Yeah, like actually being patient and listening to people instead of thinking you already know what they're going to say. Curiosity and playfulness. Yeah, people are going to show up and stay more if it's fun. If there was dancing, if there were games, if there was things that are fun. People need to have fun. Listening, that is like a skill. Sharing power and decision making. A lot of these workshops in this series have been about that. How do we make groups that are transparent and where people understand how decisions are being made so that when I show up, I know how to become a full member. I know what it would take. If I disagree with something, I know how to like be heard. Like that's essential to having people want to stay. And I'm not going to stay in a group where I'm being bossed around by somebody. Like it's an unpaid role. I'm not going to like, I have a boss at my job, Yeah. Okay. Adrian writes, no acronyms. Make it easy for new folks to understand what you're doing. Yeah. Like if you go to a meeting and everyone's talking about some decision, but you have been given no context for what they're talking about and they're using acronyms and you're just like, I clearly am missing something and no one cares that I'm missing it. So how do we welcome new people and orient them and make sure they have a buddy who they can be like, hey, wait, what are you guys talking about? Or, give them a little bit of the group's history. Like, how do we make sure we think about what the experience might be like for a new person? Let's see. Yeah, actively engaging new people to share their thoughts and ideas. People want to be heard when they join social movement work. They want to be like, they're pissed and scared about something. They want to do something. They want to find people who they can say what they're mad about to, who are like, yeah. So you got to give them a chance to say it. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Chalk projects, sign making, a lot of like creative work is a great way to bring new people in. When the uprising first started and there was a police free zone here in Seattle that was called CHOP or Chaz, I noticed a lot of people came from like the whole northwestern quarter of the United States to be like, I'm coming here to join the movement. And they drove from Idaho and Montana, and they'd never been to anything like this before, and they'd never been in the movement. And they showed up in like basically this ball field in this park to be like, okay, I'm ready. And what I saw was that people really engaged with these big art projects that were happening and these gardening projects because it was a way to like immediately plug in. Like people they didn't want to just sit around. They wanted to like meet other people, talk about what they're mad about, like do something, you know? Remembering people when they come back, especially their names, Kate says, yeah. Having a clear onboarding process, Katie says, and a buddy system and a cool zine. When I arrived at my current place, Ash says, I was given responsibilities slowly that built over time. That's cool. Asking for input from people who are new. Humor. This is great. Playing music. One-on-one communication to create personal relationships that have value so that each new person knows like, oh, you know, Gabriel's a person who I can text about this, right? Also like following up people, like if they show up for one meeting and they don't show up for the next one, being like, oh, hey, we missed you. Like, do you want me to tell you what happened at the meeting? Like, just like making people know they were thought about, that they're wanted. Building time for fun and community building. It can't be work all the time. We need to care for each other as well. Yeah, that's a great point. Frequent onboarding meetings. Lee says, yeah, in some groups I'm in, we'll have like quarterly, like a big orientation for new members. And so we'll put that out on social media, like Saturday in April, we're having a meeting, and that meeting is designed for people who've never been to our group before. And it's like, hey, here's what we've been up to. Here's our big campaign. Here's ways we can get involved. Here's a team you can join. Here's a need we have. You know, here's a go around where we each can say why we care about this. Like, you know, it does all those things. It's like, it's setting a tone of like, we want you. This is what we are. You can know about it. It's transparent. You can be caught up. We can plug you in right away. Like all those pieces. Ash says, it was welcoming because my pronouns were respected. So thinking about stuff like that, like did we set up a space that had good guidelines about people not having to have like shitty experiences? Zach says people are more likely to join if it's easy to find and to deepen, if there's multiple access points, relationship building, consistent calls to participation, and they're more likely to stay if there's culture building, consent, and growth. That's like a beautiful summary. Rashana says food. Everybody's saying food. Culture of care. Yeah, having food at the meetings. Loving on each other. Child care can be really relevant to a lot of groups. Yeah. Not acting like a nonprofit. You know, not making everything super formalistic, but instead making it like authentic to the people who are doing it. You know, I've seen groups really effective. Like I remember being at various like queer marches and protests where people were doing like really amazing, like coordinated dances with percussion, and that people wanted to join that group, you know, people had cool matching outfits, like just like making it glamorous, making it snazzy, you know? Yeah, Joyce asked, what's a different word for than onboarding? Yeah, I think that some groups I'm in talk about like bringing people in, or like building members, or building membership, or building participation. Yeah, these are great. Great. There's so much great stuff in the chat. You'll be able to access this chat in the recording of the video afterwards. That'll be on the BCRW YouTube page. Yeah, and David asks, you know, are these ideas that you already need to be large to implement? I think that part of it is we can generate a lot of ideas, but then a group can be like, what's actually most useful to us? So like doing something like having a meeting for new members, once every 6 months or once every 3 months or whatever, that's something that even a really small group could have, and could tell the community about and spread the word through other spaces and organizations. And that makes the group bigger, or, I mean, there's any number of things that, you could decide we're going to prioritize this or that because of what our group needs. Okay, let's see. So what else helps people join, deepen, and stay? So I want to talk specifically about this piece that people want to feel like they are doing something. People do not want to feel like I was invited, but I don't have any role. I'm just going to meetings and listening, or I feel maybe even tokenized. That's a pretty common feeling. So how do you all think we do that? How do you get people going on tasks they care about? What has worked for you? How do you help people actually get going in the work in a way where they feel like I'm plugged in, I'm doing something about what I care about? Someone had mentioned earlier, like having clear shifts that are open, like before you have the orientation meeting or before you put the word out, like, hey, we want to start doing Tuesdays. We need 5 people to do shifts on Tuesdays, tabling or whatever. Providing simple tasks for newcomers. Yeah, and like one group I was in, we would often have like the night before we were doing some kind of street action, we would have like a big like poster making and like banner making. And so that was a great place to bring new people in because you're hanging out, you're chatting with somebody, you're, painting. And that would be like a first task. And then maybe someone would be like, yeah, I would join a team that coordinates these banner making parties, or I would join a team that does the Instagram, or that coordinates food for these other actions you guys are doing or whatever. Monique says co-develop a task list with sign up. Yeah, that's great. Martha says invite people to large food rescues and say how much fun it is. Pytherton says we ask people to choose some types of work they want to do, and then I connect them with someone that on that work group. Yeah, so that's really great. Like you can give people a little survey. Some people have that kind of like an intake form, like, hey, you're new. What do you like to do? What are your access needs? Why do you care about this? Whatever. There can be a way. That's one option is to like give people a little menu. Yeah, starting a project and asking who wants to join. Clear expectations, encourage autonomy, but clear tasks are needed. Yeah, we shouldn't assume that people have done the task before or that they know how to do it. So figuring that out, like how to give enough support and also enough autonomy, that can be like a question. Yeah, great. These are really helpful. Okay. Oops. Yeah, and I also just wanted to say this thing, I've already said it a couple times, but I think people really, really need, like, kind of the first thing a lot of people need when they show up is a chance to say that what they're pissed or scared about. Like, they want a chance to say, like, "I'm so mad about what's happening to, immigrants, and this is what happened to my family, and it pisses me off," or, "I'm so mad about this thing I saw on the news," or, I was heartbroken to see what's happening in this jail," or whatever. Like, when people show up to the mutual aid group, or any political group, they need a chance to be heard. It is like a human need. Like, oh my God, I'm here to find my people who also care about this and do something about it together. And so even having the most basic go round at a meeting that's like, why are you here? Or why do you care about this? Can make people feel more included than if they never got to say that out loud in the group. And it's not about, some people might, I pass, but like just having the option to be heard and have other people like, yeah. And it can be hard if you've been in the work forever. You might be like, yeah. Like, yes, we all hate the youth jail or whatever. But actually, like, it's really enlivening to the group to let people say that each time. Yes, and Maya says that can be intimidating. Yeah, so always have the option of people to pass, or to do it in pairs, but just something that lets people who want to say what they care about. They may have never said this to anyone before because they may be in a friend circle or a family where it's not okay to have this politics, and they're just starting to let themselves have it. And so it can be a really vital experience. So just a few, overall words about this. people, it's okay that people join social movement groups because we have social needs. Like, yes, we're trying to like, win the world we want, but also right now we're all like people who need like our basic social needs met. And one of those needs is dignity. Like the feeling of being like, I'm so angry about living in a society that's letting all these people die of COVID. And I showed up at a place where we're gonna do something about it, or letting people live in cages, or whatever the thing is that I'm pissed about. Like it's so dignifying to find other people who are also mad about what you're mad about. And so the chance to have that feeling like, I have dignity and integrity, I'm going to match my values to my actions, like that's a deep human need that people can get in social movement groups that is appropriate to look for there. People also need belonging and connection, and we are more isolated than we've ever been. I mean, even before COVID, our society was full of isolation, and now obviously there's been new levels of isolation. So yeah, people need a chance to feel like I'm part of something, I belong somewhere, I'm in a group. Like this group like sees me as one of them, even if we're all really different from each other, like I belong here. So how do we cultivate that in our groups, a sense of connection? And all of you have been talking about relationships. I mean, I've heard so many organizers say for so long, social movements are only made of relationships, and they're only as strong as our relationships. So like, and we live in a society that tells us that relationships don't matter, only like outcomes and profits and stuff like that matters. So we all have to really pivot to be like, wow, like the quality of each of these relationships really matters. Like whether or not I even like this person, I care about having a positive, like connected relationship with them because we're trying to make this change together. Another sort of basic human social need is safety. And the most dangerous thing for people is to be isolated. So joining groups and finding people who care about you and will have your back is like vital to our safety and survival. And that is a social need we can meet in social movement groups. And finally, of course, creativity, right? The experience of like expressing ourselves, of being like, what would be a cool way to do this? What would be a hilarious slogan? Let's write a mini play about it. Let's use these colors on the banner, whatever, like that, like those experiences of like expression, like that is such a vital need. And so just thinking about, I raise this stuff is obvious, but I raise it because if we think about designing our groups in ways that will better meet each other's social needs, the groups will be stronger. And I know a lot of people have come to these workshops really concerned about conflict in groups, like conflict is tearing groups apart. The better we get at building structures and habits and culture in the group around these needs, the less our conflict will tear us apart and the less conflict we'll have, And the last workshop was more about conflict prevention and like giving and receiving feedback and things like that. But I think this is really relevant to the recruitment piece. I also want to say, there's a link that Sophie's putting in the chat to this chart that I made, but like part of what we're doing here is we're trying to get people to move from like seeing like the way we're supposed to see like dissent in our society is that like I have a cause, like I care about the animals, or like I care about the homeless people. Like there's this kind of like distance, like cause thing that's kind of like celebrity philanthropy sort of frame. We don't want people to have a pet cause. We want people to join the struggle for liberation and stay in it their entire lives and shape their lives around it and be like, yeah, it determines how I think about what I eat. It determines how I think about how I treat everyone. It determines how I think about, where I am willing to work, all of it, right? So this question of like, how do we take people who might have initial interest that's kind of like a cause interest, like, oh, I saw this on Instagram and it's cool, or I want to look woke in my feed by having this picture at this protest. How do we take those people and be like, there is a kernel in there of fire, and I want to like help you cook it up and like help it become like a like sustaining, nourishing, raging fire that like passionately burns in your life forever. Like, how do we help people cross that bridge instead of being like judgy that they're not there? Like, it's our society. We're all brainwashed, right? How do we help people even learn that you can have a life that is entirely focused around liberation and justice and transformation. Like I feel like so many of my students, like, they don't have a single friend who believes in what they believe in, like, who's, hates the cops or, like, is really worried about climate change. Like, they just have all these friends who were their friends for other reasons, like they're the same age and they were in class together or whatever, and they like the same social media stuff, or they like the same, TV shows or music. But like, I was like, yeah, like most of my friends are just from social movements, and a lot of them, we don't have any of that stuff in common. We're not the same age. We didn't grow up in the same place. We don't like all the same, cultural entertainment. We just like really hate the cops, or we like really love poor people and hate wealth and poverty or whatever. And is, and like, that is like mobilizing our connection together. And it is so strong, and it's so beautiful and amazing to have friendships that are and sustain around those deep beliefs and forms of care. And so, it's just like our society is just telling us to be shallow, escapist, entertainment based, numb, and we're trying to build movements and social relations where people are like get to be like deep and connected and like really caring and have like really good fun and pleasure, not like really light cheap thrills, but like really like fascinating, engaged delight, because they are just more alive and awake. And so I just shared that chart, not to go deep in it, but just because I found it just an ongoing dilemma. Yeah, I'm just looking at what people are saying. It's so isolating to have friends, not to have friends that share your values. Yeah, it can be really hard. Yeah, book clubs, learning from experience, learning from others, all of that can be really useful for like getting people in to imagining the world beyond maybe their first kind of cause piece. Yeah, great. So I wanted to share that framing, and then a couple other things that I think we can do. And some of these we've mentioned, but I really think that making sure that it's clear how our groups work. And I did some of the other workshops really look at decision making, but I would say that like most mutual aid groups do not have clear decision making methods or any kind of transparent structure that a new person could come to and be like, oh yeah, I get how it works. Instead, like someone's just kind of deciding everything, and everyone's just kind of like letting them, or it's chaotic and no one knows if a decision was made. All of that makes it hard for people to join. And it like often leads to worse conflict, and things falling apart and disorganization, or we dropped the ball and people in our community didn't get what we said we were going to give. So I just really want to encourage, like, so many groups like call themselves a collective, but there actually is no collective structure, like there's nothing inside that. So I think I would encourage people to go back to the workshops where we talk about decision making, and see if any of those tools are useful for making like an actual, like, we know how decisions are made. It includes everyone. It's got the wisdom of the group. It's not just one person bossing us around. As I mentioned before, like having orientations for new members, like having some kind of new member meetings, and that can be like small or big. It could be small, like just like, hey, yeah, come on Saturday, we're going to have a thing for new members. This is how you sign up for shifts. But it can also be pretty deep values work. Like it can be like, we're also going to do a mini workshop on giving and receiving feedback, and why this group really tries to use direct communication instead of gossip. Or we're going to do a mini workshop on disability justice, and how we try to run our group, through a disability justice lens, and what that means. And it's going to be like, it's going to give us like shared language to talk about that in all of our work. Or we're going to do a mini workshop on the history of this kind of mutual aid work in our town, because we want that shared political awareness like inspires us, and it also helps us like orient to our principles and kind of what's worked and what hasn't worked in the past here, whatever. But this kind of orientation could be anything. There could be something just for new members, and then there could be like regular workshops for everybody about things like giving and receiving feedback, or disability justice, or toxic masculinity, or whatever. But I guess one of the things that this workshop series is about is how do we avoid just focusing on the output of a group, and instead do more to build the group culture and the group skills so that the group's more sustainable. So all of that kind of like capacity building, like choosing to do that inside the group instead of just being like, how many burritos can we get out this weekend? Meanwhile, we're like at each other's throats, and that's not going to make new people want to hang out with us because bad vibes. I'm curious if there's other kinds of content that you all could see going into an orientation that you think would be useful for your group or for other groups that you've been part of or that you didn't join because you didn't feel welcomed. Yeah, someone mentions dating apps. I mean, a really real reason why people join social movement groups is to meet people to date. That's great. Like to meet friends, to meet dates, to find your people, like that is totally legit. Then also when we're in the groups, we need to like be ethical in how we do our sex and dating because we also wreck each other with that a lot. But it is possible to have that be a great place to meet people. Community agreements, great. Yeah, thanks, Gerardo. Right, that talking together at the orientation about how we like to talk. Like, hey, we all like to use each other's pronouns correctly and pronounce each other's names the way that they're actually pronounced. And we like to do 3 before me. Like, I'm going to have 3 people talk before I talk again, or whatever our community agreements are about how we want to make a rad conversation. Safety trainings, yeah, like trainings about consent, trainings about sexual harassment, etc. Giving people buddies, Maya, that's super helpful. Giving people space to say, Martha says to say, why are you here? What makes you be here? Have you done this before? Alicia, short-term goals for the orientation, past fundraising successes, and just like the history of the struggle. Like in a lot of groups I'm in, we just always are like, oh yeah, this really comes back to 5 years ago when we first started this campaign to close this facility down or whatever. These are some of the big things that have happened. These have been our allies and these have been our opposition. Let's see what else. Accountability processes and COVID expectations, really helpful. Great. Yeah, shared expectations is a big one. Like, I was just working with a group last night and they were like, whenever we start a new working group, we want there to be clarity. Like, we think this working group will take each person in it about, 10 hours a month of work or 20 hours a month of work or whatever, so that like, oh, can I join that or not? Like give people some sense of like what it really takes and so that they can really assess like, oh, can I do that? We also, the first workshop in this series, we talked about group capacity and accountability and like, what do you do when people are flaky? And so having a workshop about like that, about like, what do we do when we're flaky? How do I like to be, what helps me be accountable to things I've promised to do? What makes it hard? How do I like people to talk to me about if I fell off on my test that I promised? Like just, those conversations in groups can really improve accountability about doing tasks instead of just like talking shit behind each other's backs. Great. Mariana talks about creating a space during the orientation for people to name the skills that they're bringing to the group. Great. Yeah, like I'm excited. I want to do art with this group, or I really love like tracking stuff in an Excel spreadsheet or whatever. John asked, how do we make sure we don't overwhelm people with new information? Yeah. So how to make it visual, how to make it fun, how to make the meeting not too long. These are all great questions that are just like group culture questions, like try it out, and I think if you have a tendency to pack the time, just err on the other side, cut out half of the content, make sure the relationship building is big in the meeting. Yeah, Sarah is like, maybe it's appropriate to map out locations of each person and cross streets so that people know where people are. That in some groups, especially neighborhood-based groups, that could be totally appropriate to be like, let's look at a map of where we all are and like get excited to find out that we're neighbors, and especially if you're meeting on Zoom or something. Yeah, Jillian says that in their group, they include what mutual aid is and is not. So you're giving people the philosophy of the group, which is really exciting. How to get involved, what roles, how to avoid burnout, how to do self-care and boundaries, and what are upcoming events. Phone lists, Jasper says. Yeah, that's great. So people know how to reach a lot of people. These are really great. Thank you, guys. Yeah. One other thing I just put on this slide is like, just reminding us like another way to make mutual aid work bigger is to make it easy. Like, let's say we're all in a group in the neighborhood. Let's make it easy to split that group in two if it's actually becoming pretty big, and we can just split the neighborhood in half along this street or whatever. Like, it's not threatening for groups to split or for people to replicate the work. How do we not have like an ego trip about that? But instead, we want people. We want more groups. We want more and more and more and more. And so it's not trying to build an empire. Like, how can I be the emperor of food delivery projects of Seattle? Like, anything that centralizes power, that builds up one person's reputation, that tries to snuff out other similar groups and sees them as competitors. We've now lost track of mutual aid, and we're in like, competitive, nonprofit-y kind of norms that are really toxic and deadly for our movements. The last thing I want to talk about before we go into the Q&A, originally I had this session be focused on leadership qualities for mutuality, and I switched the topic because people were talking about what they needed. But I do just want to lift it up because it's totally relevant. It's like, what kinds of people building are we trying to do in these groups, right? Like, so I've had Sophie put the link to this chart that I made in the chat. And this is just my brainstorm. We could, so many people would have more to add of like, on the one side, I have like, what are kind of hierarchical leadership qualities? This is like, what have we been told in our society a leader looks like? And especially, what are we told that like, it's like kind of like a masculinist, like, how to be the boss kind of vibe. Like, I would say like white settler values about bossing people around. And then how do we like kind of let go of that idea of a leader and actually figure out what a leader is in mutual aid groups that are trying to get really like cover a lot of people's needs and get bigger and be sustainable and build liberation. And one way I think about this a lot is that the main job of a leader is to support other people's leadership, right? So instead of like bossing people, you're trying to like support people to become even more active, even more participatory, even more heard. And so you're not like center stage, you're like trying to make sure the mic gets passed all around, right? Trying to make people feel all the ways they could participate. And that's the opposite of like the bossy leadership model, like of our society. So I just wanted to share this chart, and I'm curious to people in the chat if there's things that stand out or if you have opinions about how we cultivate these qualities in participants in our groups and in ourselves, or how we unlearn dominance behaviors, right? Like, how do I stop thinking that I'll be safe or that my life will be good if I'm the boss of more stuff? One of the examples I've used a lot in these workshops is I feel like most of us have been taught to try to be right and to try to like come in and bring our idea and get it through and push it through. But the skill we really need to build strong groups and to build this work is a skill of being able to bring an idea and be really excited to hear how other people disagree, because that will make the idea better, right? Like, oh, like I'm like, we should do this on Tuesdays at 4 for 6 months. And then Ash is like, actually Tuesdays isn't a great day because of this. And then somebody else is like, I really think we should start this at 10 a.m. And like that, it's the idea is getting better when everyone's saying how it's different from my original idea. So instead of trying to like steamroll my idea through, I'm trying to like be influenced and influence others and have the wisdom of the group build the best idea that the most of us can live with and will implement. And so that is like a really different skill, like the desire to be disagreed with instead of the desire to be right. Yeah, someone says the term generative conflict. That's a great way of saying it. Yeah, Teach Liberation says campaigning versus collaborating, right? I think that because we live in a society that says that we should do quote unquote majority rule, not that we live in a majority rule society. We are ruled by a tiny elite of, white billionaires. But because we believe in that idea is about like outvoting others. It's like, I'm going to bring my idea in and I'm going to see how many people in this group will choose me over the alternative. And it's like, that's all about splitting the group. That means a bunch of people are going to like not get what they want. I'm like, what if the goal was to try to make sure as many people get as much of what they want as possible? and that we like massage this proposal until it supports the most people's well-being. Yeah, Ollie talks about caring for our inner children and inner selves, taking care of our own wants and needs, and having internal and external support and care structures. This is a very profound insight because a lot of us play out our shit in these groups. You know, we've all come from like really terrible, like, you know, dynamics of domination inside families and schools and workplaces. And we often just ricochet all that in a mutual aid group and can really hurt each other. And so having a basic level of emotional awareness, like, am I activated right now? Am I sitting in this meeting kind of thinking that Ollie is like my mean dad, or, you know, my sister who I have to save, or whatever the things were that people, you know, that you lived through, or this boss I had, or, you know, what all the people at my school were like when they all rejected me or whatever. Like having some level of, am I playing out a drama that is that really happened to me and that this is reminding me of, but it's maybe making me like think people in this room are my enemies, or want to see everybody hate this person with me. Like there's a lot of that stuff that goes on, and it's really tearing apart a lot of groups. And there's just no replacement for like building our own emotional awareness so that we can not be totally ruled when we get kind of taken over by those memories. And we're like, oh, wait, this might not be happening exactly as I'm perceiving it. And can I get support? And there's nothing wrong with how I'm perceiving it, but can I get support rather than taking it out on everybody around me? Mariana talks about not guilting people. I think that's really essential, right? When people flake, or when people haven't taken on a lot, like finding out like what they can take on. And, you know, it doesn't mean not having accountability. If people flake on stuff, it has an impact on others. We should tell people how they impact us in a way that's loving and not about throwing them away. That's like very actually dignifying to be able to hear like how you impacted me, how I impacted you, but not about guilting. Yeah. This is great. Yeah, great. Thank you all. So yeah, I am going to go over to some of the questions that Sophie has put for me on a list. So one person asks, how do you organize when you can't find people with the same problems as you, or can't find solutions to your shared problems? One thing I'd say about that is that a lot of groups historically, you know, you organize where it's hot. So like I'm thinking right now about the Young Lords, you know, in the 1970s, particularly working in New York City, Puerto Rican activists who were dedicated to, you know, changing the lives of people, Puerto Ricans living in the United States, and decolonizing Puerto Rico. And when they first got started, they were inspired by the Black Panther Party. And they wanted to do stuff like the Black Panther Party. And they asked everyone in the neighborhood, like, what are people most pissed about? And people were most pissed about the trash in the neighborhood. And they were very surprised by this. Like that wasn't what they were thinking of doing. But then that was what people were pissed about. So they were like, great. And they did all these radical actions, like filled the streets with the trash. And, you know, they went to the city sanitation department and said, you need to give us supplies to clean the trash in the neighborhood. And the sanitation department said no. And they just took all the brooms and bags, and, you know, these very militant, inspiring actions that really fired people up and made people be like, yeah, Puerto Ricans fighting back against this system. But it wasn't their first choice of the issue. These young people who want to do the organizing, they just listened to what the community wanted. So I think one way to think about it is organizers are willing to go where it's at, you know, to start with what's hot, with what's on. And then also be cultivating relationships to build something else you're dreaming of, people getting fired up about. But a lot of times we do start by just building relationships with where people already are interested or willing to organize, and kind of seeing how it develops. Because there may not be groups already in my area doing the thing I care about, or whatever. Someone asks, how do you bring back folks that don't participate as much or are affected by burnout? I think that's still relationship based, like staying in touch, asking people how it's going, what's keeping you from the meeting? Is there anything we could do to support you coming back? do you want me to touch base in 6 months? Like, I just think like people feeling cared about is huge. That's what I've seen work. Instead of like, oh, I didn't come, so I feel guilty, and everyone there is probably judging me. I can never go back. Like, but instead, people being like, oh yeah, you're welcome back whenever you want. Can we make the task smaller for you, or do you want to just come and not take on a task at this meeting, and we'll just get to have your wisdom? Just like removing barriers and staying in touch. How can we safely bring new people into mutual aid groups that are run by and support people who are criminalized, like people who use drugs or people who do sex work? Yeah, I think that a lot of groups that are doing mutual aid with people who are criminalized, like, have a lot of careful things around that, like how to make sure that new people who come into groups are trained on harm reduction ideas, learn about the risks that participants are facing and how to support participants, use more secure methods potentially for communications, because of concern about having like lists of participants' names or information somewhere that could be used by law enforcement. I think those kinds of questions are great. And if you're thinking about doing that, I think one of the best ways to do it is just to ask other groups that are doing it. Like, how are you guys doing this? Because there's so many people doing, and have been forever, such deep work with current drug users and sex workers and other, undocumented people, other people who are at risk for criminalization or deportation. How do you live a life centered around liberation when you need to pay rent? I love that question. Yeah, everybody I know has to work. I mean, there are some people I know I hear of people who don't have to work, but most people I know have to work. We have to pay rent. The way I think about that is twofold. One is that we'll have to work less if we reduce our expenses. So one thing that some people are able to do is like living in a group house can be cheaper, and then I won't have to work as many hours. Or like, I think a lot of people I know shaped their lives around how to make my life as cheap as possible so that I have to give as little of my time as possible to working for money, which is deeply compromising. Like, it's hard to know of a job you can do for money that isn't, like part of a fucked up system, So I think that's one thing people do. I feel like some people I know try to make their paid job at least somewhat aligned with their values. Like, maybe if I'm a nurse, I can also figure out ways to like steal supplies and give them to the mutual aid project, or like get people care who would have been treated badly, So some people do that. Or maybe if I'm a teacher, I can bring radical ideas into the classroom or whatever, or organize with parents and other teachers and students. And some people I know are like, I just want a job that I don't have to think about at all besides when I'm there, so I can put all of my energy into my organizing, I think, and art or other things. So I think there's a lot of ways through this tangle, none of which are like pure or easy. But just like, once we're asking that question, we're already in a good place. Like, that's already a great question. And I think the thing about how we can reduce our expenses by living collectively is a really big one, because rent is so high, and that can be really demobilizing. Like, it's just almost impossible to raise it. And so some people move to cheaper cities or rural areas because of that, or figure out how to squat, or just live with a larger group of people. And that's not for everybody, but I have seen people make those choices, and it's been a way through. What should groups that are predominantly white and wealthy do when trying to manifest leadership by people from more impacted communities? Or is starting with privileged folks not recuperable? It's a really great question. One question I've gotten a lot from mutual aid groups in the last 2 years has been like this difficult situation that people find themselves in, where they're like, are we doing this in a charity way? Because most of the people coming here for support to the mutual aid project are, let's say, unhoused, or otherwise like living in crisis, and most of the people providing the support are not living in that same crisis. Does that mean it's charity? Does that mean it's not mutual aid? Should we stop? And I think one key insight is that the conditions are so unequal right now that I think that might lead to that a lot. Like, if we're supporting people in an encampment of unhoused people, a lot of people in that encampment might be living under conditions where it's hard for them to come to a meeting, especially if it's on Zoom. And so that might be a real tension. But that does not mean we should stop supporting the encampment. Like that cannot be the answer. Like if the work isn't perfect, it must stop. Instead, we might do things like, okay, how can we maximize the input of people who can't make it to meetings into our work? So if we're going to sit at the phone charging station for hours in the encampment, can we strike up conversations with people who are charging their phones where we're like, hey, we're thinking about adding something on Wednesdays. What do you think about that? Hey, we're thinking about collaborating with this other group. Do you like them? What do you think about that? Like, how can we bring people in decision making in ways that are the lowest barrier to them? Even though our group might have like the primary stewardship that's happening is happening from like people who are not directly affected. Like, is there a way to like build bridges towards changing the group where the group's wisdom is coming from, even if we can't perfect like our dream of having the group be 90% unhoused people making all the decisions, like if that's not available immediately because of a lot of like really concrete reasons. So I really just encourage people to like not stop doing work because it's not perfect, because it will never be perfect. And to be like, okay, let's get curious and creative. Like, are there other groups that we could be forming relationships with whose membership is more aligned with where we think would be like the ethically where our membership is? Would they collaborate with us? Would they help do an assessment of whether or not there are obstacles to participating in our group that we're missing? Would they want to have an advisory role so that we're getting that input more like officially from people from that community? I mean, just there's, just like, what can we do besides just wring our hands about it or quit, and I think there's a lot of options there. And I have seen groups transform their membership. I have seen groups that were started by white people become predominantly people of color, or that were started by people with wealth become predominantly working class. It's not easy. And it requires like really intentional, like recruitment, relationship building, making sure the org is transparent so that people entering have good experiences. All right. One thing I didn't talk about, someone just asked, are there any red flags you look out for with new recruits? I just want to name that in social movement organizations, I see two tendencies. One tendency is to be super suspicious of everybody, to be like, they might be, agents or infiltrators from the government. We don't know. They might be undercover Nazis, whatever, or they might be flakes. And the other one is to be like really, really, really like welcoming, and like everybody who walks in, we give them like, the bank account, and we need something in between. Like we need to have a sober assessment of how secure our work is. Like if you're doing work that's like illegal and you're like helping criminalized people get something, or helping people get something that is a crime to get, you need more security. And if you're doing most mutual aid work, you don't need as much security. If you're handling money, you might not want to have people who you just met be the ones who hold the money. Just like this kind of like stuff. And I find that inside mutual aid groups and all groups, people have different tendencies. Some of us are like the big inviters, and some of us are like the suspicious, like, concerned about new members. And that's great. Like I'm a big inviter, and it's great for me to be in groups with people who are more distrusting, because then we're more likely to come up with like a balanced view. I'm like, I just met you. Here are the keys to my house. Come sleep over. It's good to have somebody there who's like, Dean, we need both those qualities, and we need to find some kind of like sober discernment. Someone asked, how do you start living collectively? That's a great question. I think that historically in all the towns and cities I've lived in, there have been existing like cooperatives and collectives. So finding out about the histories of cooperative and collective houses where you live, if they exist. People sometimes rent big houses together with lots of people, like from their social movement group or whatever, or just put out ads, for roommates. But basically, you can just end up paying a lot less rent. It's because it's not like everybody's paying for a kitchen. It's like you're all sharing a kitchen. And it's not saying that this is easy, but there's actually a lot of wisdom out there about living collectively and how to start cooperatives and collective houses and how to help them run smoothly and deal with common conflicts that come up in them. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's hard to do now because so much housing has been turned into luxury housing, and also, more people in the United States now live alone than ever in the history of the United States. And so there's a lot of isolation and people are paying a lot more rent. Collectivizing food is another thing. Like a lot of collective houses will have collectivized meals that can also save people a lot of money and time. Like if every one of us has our own kitchen we're paying for, we all have a colander, we all have a can opener, we all, we all have to make dinner every night. That's really different in terms of time and money than if I just make dinner on Sunday nights. And, all the other nights I get to eat dinner without having had to make it. And we're all sharing the colander and a can opener, it can really reduce how much it costs to live. How do you shift to a flat leadership model with a group that is majority but not entirely white? Yeah, I would recommend the prior workshop about decision-making, because that's all about how to create a horizontal decision-making structure, which any of us can do at any time. You just eliminate the hierarchy, create clear teams, create a decision-making chart, and that's how you run it from then on. People you just have those conversations that we went through in that workshop. And I've worked with a lot of groups to do that, to get rid of their hierarchy. Great. Just checking out these other questions. Any advice for a mutual aid group struggling to find a large kitchen, shared space to increase our capacity? Yeah, I don't know. I think that's interesting. I think people in general, how can we do a better job of putting out the word when we need something? It's like recruiting and finding space and finding materials are all kind of the same problem, of getting the word out in effective ways and figuring out networks we wouldn't think of, like communities of faith as an example in the question. But what are the networks where we can spread the word of our need? Because I do there's a lot of people who have a thing and they wish they could use it to help somebody, but they don't know how to, we're mismatching. I also we only have 2 minutes left. I want to just say one more thing about this goal of having people's participation in mutual aid build their participation in radical movements, build their boldness and their ability to participate in movements in really fierce ways. A lot of the mutual aid that sprung up during the first year and a half of COVID was people just collecting money and then giving it to people for rent or other expenses. And that is so great and so needed. But a lot of it didn't actually move people into deeper movement participation. It just reminded me to Venmo. And so one of the questions I think a lot of those groups are asking, and then people sometimes kind of fell off, because they weren't really engaged more. So how do we get people to not just give money? Because we're never going to get enough money that way to solve poverty and end capitalism. You know what I mean? It's a great thing to do right now to survive, but it's not very sustainable and it's never enough for the need. So I just think that's an example of this kind of problem we're trying to think through. How do we make all of our mutual aid groups places that build and invite more people into more participation? And how do we make that everybody's number one concern and problem? Because that's what's going to make us win or lose everything, basic survival. We are at peak conditions of bleakness. And unless we build huge movements where so many more people are participating, there's just going to be so much more suffering than there needs to be. So I think that's just the question is how do you make whatever you're doing into a people recruiting and people building machine? I hope some of the stuff from today was useful. Thank you so much, Hope, for guiding us through all this today.
I'm just here to say thank you so much to Dean, to Ken and Gloshanda, our ASL interpreters, and to Jane, who is captioning right now. And thank you to everyone who participated. These were really great questions. And Really good conversation. I think Dean mentioned a few times, we'll make sure that all of these resources stay available on BCRW's YouTube and on the website. So you should be able to find everything. But if you have any questions, you can always email us at bcrw@barnard.edu or through YouTube or social media. Thank you again, Dean, for this amazing series, and we'll continue to release short videos from this that you can share that hopefully will be tools that provide specific ideas for how you can deal with issues that your groups are facing. So thanks so much to everyone, and have a good night.